The night sky over rural Montana split open with a sound that nobody in the small town of Millbrook would ever forget. Sarah Chen was driving home from her late shift at the diner when the fireball screamed across the darkness above her truck. She slammed on the brakes and watched as the massive object crashed into the mountain range about 3 miles east of town. The ground shook so hard that car alarms started screaming throughout the valley. Sarah sat there with her hands gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had seen shooting stars before. This was not a shooting star. This was something else entirely. By morning, the entire town had gathered at the edge of the Peterson farm, which bordered the impact zone. Sheriff Tom Reeves had set up a perimeter with yellow tape, though everyone knew that yellow tape would not stop whatever had landed in those mountains. The crater was massive, stretching nearly half a mile across. Trees had been flattened in every direction, like matchsticks blown down by a giant's breath. In the center of all that destruction lay something that made every single person fall silent. It was metal. It was enormous, and it was shaped like nothing any human had ever built. The object stood at least 60 feet tall, even though it was clearly damaged and lying partially on its side. Its surface was covered in strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them from different angles. Parts of it glowed with a faint blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Steam rose from its joints and seams where the intense heat of entry was still cooling down. But the most unsettling thing about the object was its shape. It looked almost human. It had arms and legs and what could only be described as a head. It was a machine, yes, but it was built in the image of a living creature. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived from the State University within hours of the crash. He was a physicist who had spent his entire career studying theoretical possibilities of extraterrestrial technology. When he saw the object lying in that crater, he fell to his knees and started crying. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind, but Marcus knew exactly what he was looking at. This was proof. This was everything he had ever dreamed of finding. This was a machine from beyond the stars. The government showed up by the second day. Black helicopters filled the sky like angry wasps. Soldiers in unmarked uniforms cordoned off the entire mountain range. Men in suits who never gave their names started asking questions around town. They wanted to know who had seen the crash. They wanted to know if anyone had taken photographs. They wanted to know if the object had moved or made any sound since landing. Sheriff Reeves told them everything he knew, which was not much. The object had not moved. It had not made any sounds. It simply lay there in its crater, glowing softly, waiting. General Patricia Hayes took command of the operation on the third day. She was a hard woman with steel grey hair and eyes that had seen too many things that most people would never believe. She had spent 30 years dealing with situations that the public was never supposed to know about. She had seen things that would give ordinary people nightmares for the rest of their lives, but even she felt a chill run down her spine when she stood at the edge of that crater and looked down at the alien machine. The scientific team established a base camp around the crater within a week. Tents and prefabricated buildings sprouted like mushrooms across the flattened forest. Generators hummed day and night. Satellite dishes pointed at the sky, sending encrypted reports to Washington every hour. The best minds in the country were being flown in to study the object. Engineers, physicists, biologists, linguists, computer scientists, metallurgists, and dozens of other specialists all descended on the small Montana town that had never asked to be the center of the biggest discovery in human history. Sarah Chen found herself caught up in all of it, despite her best efforts to stay away. The government had hired local workers to help with construction and logistics at the base camp. The pay was good, and Sarah needed the money. Her mother's medical bills were piling up faster than she could count them, so she signed the confidentiality agreements without really reading them and started working as a cook at the facility. Every day she prepared meals for scientists and soldiers who were studying something that should not exist. Every night she lay awake in her small apartment, wondering what she had gotten herself into. Dr. Webb led the initial examination team. They spent days just walking around the object, taking measurements and photographs from every possible angle. The machine was even more impressive up close than it was from a distance. Its surface was made of a metal alloy that did not match anything in the periodic table. The geometric patterns on its skin were not decorative. They were functional. They appeared to be some kind of circuitry or information network embedded directly into the structure of the machine. The blue glow came from energy conduits that ran throughout the entire body. Even damaged and dormant, the object contained more power than a dozen nuclear reactors. The breakthrough came on the 12th day after the crash. One of the junior researchers, a young woman named Jennifer Park, noticed something that everyone else had missed. The patterns on the machine's surface were not random. They formed a language, a complex mathematical language that used geometry and energy signatures instead of written symbols. Jennifer spent 3 sleepless nights decoding the basic structure of this language. When she finally cracked it, she discovered something that changed everything. The machine was not dead. It was sleeping. Dr. Webb called an emergency meeting to discuss Jennifer's findings. The object was in some kind of hibernation mode. Its core systems had shut down to prevent total destruction during the crash, but its essential functions were still running at a minimal level. It was healing itself. Slowly, particle by particle, molecule by molecule, the machine was repairing the damage it had sustained. At the current rate, it would take approximately 2 years for the repairs to complete, but when they did, the machine would wake up. General Hayes did not like this news at all. She immediately ordered the construction of containment systems around the crater. Concrete walls were poured, steel barriers were erected, weapons systems were brought in and aimed directly at the sleeping giant. If the machine woke up hostile, they needed to be ready to destroy it, if they could destroy it. Nobody actually knew if human weapons would have any effect on something built from materials that did not exist on Earth. The first sign of outside interest came exactly 30 days after the crash. Private Richard Martinez was on night watch at the outer perimeter when his equipment started going crazy. His radio filled with static. His night vision goggles flickered and died. The compass on his belt started spinning in circles. He was reaching for his backup radio when he saw the lights in the sky. They were not stars. They were not planes. They were ships. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They hung in the upper atmosphere like diamonds scattered across black velvet, completely silent, completely still. Martinez ran back to base camp, screaming at the top of his lungs. By the time he reached the command center, half the facility had already seen the lights. General Hayes was on a secure line to Washington within minutes. The president was woken from his sleep. The Joint Chiefs were summoned to an emergency session. Defense systems across the entire country were placed on high alert, and still the lights hung in the sky, watching, waiting. The message came 3 hours later. It broadcast on every frequency simultaneously: radio, television, internet, satellite communications, cellular networks, everything. The voice that spoke was not human, but it had learned human language with perfect accuracy. It spoke in English, Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, and a dozen other languages, all at the same time. The message was simple and terrifying. The collective demands the return of the Guardian unit, designated Sentinel Prime. You have 7 planetary rotations to comply. Failure to comply will result in reclamation by force. This world will suffer no permanent harm if you cooperate. Resistance will be considered an act of war. The collective does not lose wars. The world erupted into chaos. News networks broadcast the message on endless loops. Religious leaders declared the end times had arrived. Stock markets crashed within hours. People flooded into the streets. Some celebrating first contact with alien life, others preparing for what they believed would be the apocalypse. Governments around the world demanded answers that nobody had. And through it all, the lights in the sky remained perfectly still. General Hayes gathered her team in the command center for a meeting that would determine the fate of humanity. The options were limited, and none of them were good. They could surrender the machine and hope that the aliens were telling the truth about leaving peacefully. They could refuse and face an invasion from a civilization that was clearly far more advanced than anything on Earth. Or they could try to negotiate, to buy time, to find some third option that nobody had thought of yet. Dr. Webb made an argument that surprised everyone. He believed they should try to wake the machine themselves. If Sentinel Prime, as the aliens called it, had crashed on Earth while being pursued by the collective, then maybe it was not friendly with them. Maybe it had been running from them. Maybe it would fight on humanity's side if given the chance. It was a long shot, but it was better than either surrendering or fighting alone against a force they could not hope to defeat. The president gave his approval after 12 hours of debate. They would attempt to wake the machine. They would try to communicate with it. They would pray that it was friend rather than foe. And while they worked on that impossible task, the military would prepare for the worst. Every nation on Earth agreed to set aside their differences in the face of this common threat. For the first time in human history, the entire planet united under a single purpose: survival. Sarah Chen was delivering lunch to the containment area when the first attempt to wake the machine began. She watched through the observation window as Dr. Webb and his team connected their equipment to the energy conduits on the machine's surface. The blue glow intensified for a moment. The geometric patterns rippled like water disturbed by a thrown stone. Then everything went dark. The machine had shut down the intrusion automatically. It did not want to be woken up by strangers. Jennifer Park had a different idea. She had continued studying the language embedded in the machine's surface. She believed that the patterns were not just a language, but also a form of consciousness. The machine was aware of everything happening around it, even in its dormant state. It was listening. It was watching. It was making decisions based on what it observed. If they wanted to wake it up, they needed to earn its trust. They needed to show it that humans were worth saving. The plan that Jennifer proposed was unconventional, to say the least. Instead of trying to force the machine awake with technology, they would simply talk to it. They would share human culture with it: music, art, literature, philosophy, history, everything that made humanity worth knowing. They would project these things onto the machine's surface, where its embedded consciousness could absorb them. They would show it the best of what humanity had to offer. General Hayes thought the plan was ridiculous, but she was running out of options. The collective had given them 7 days. 4 of those days were already gone. If Jennifer's approach did not work, they could still try military options as a last resort. So she gave her approval, and the strangest first contact protocol in human history began. Sarah found herself volunteering for the project without really understanding why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the feeling that she needed to do something meaningful with her life before the world possibly ended. Whatever the reason, she joined the small team of people who sat around the sleeping giant every day and shared pieces of human culture with it. They played music first: Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, jazz and blues and rock and roll, folk songs from every continent, lullabies that mothers had sung to their children for thousands of years. The machine did not respond at first, but Jennifer noticed subtle changes in its patterns. The geometric shapes shifted slightly whenever certain types of music played. It seemed to prefer complexity. It seemed to appreciate patterns within patterns. They moved on to visual art next. Paintings from every era of human history were projected onto screens set up around the crater. The machine saw cave paintings made by ancient hands and digital art created just weeks before its arrival. It saw portraits and landscapes and abstract expressions of human emotion. Again, the patterns on its surface shifted and changed, absorbing everything it was shown. Sarah started reading to it on the 5th day. She sat in a folding chair about 20 feet from the machine's massive head and read aloud from her favorite books. She started with classics because she thought that was what she should do, but the patterns did not seem very interested in Jane Austen or Charles Dickens. On a whim, she switched to science fiction. She read stories about humans traveling to the stars, about first contact with alien civilizations, about machines that gained consciousness and wondered about their place in the universe. The patterns went wild. For the first time, the machines seemed genuinely interested. Day 6 arrived, with no visible progress. The lights in the sky began moving, descending slowly through the atmosphere. The collective was getting impatient. General Hayes ordered the facility to full defensive alert. Soldiers took positions around the containment area, with weapons that might as well have been toys compared to the technology floating above their heads. The president addressed the nation and asked people to remain calm. Nobody remained calm. Sarah was alone with the machine when it finally happened. Everyone else had gone to prepare for the expected attack, but she could not bring herself to leave. She sat in her chair with a worn paperback copy of Brave New World and read until her voice gave out. Then she just sat there, looking up at the sleeping giant, wondering if any of it had made a difference. The voice that spoke was not loud. It was not mechanical or robotic. It was warm and curious, and somehow sad. It spoke directly into Sarah's mind, bypassing her ears entirely. "You are the one who reads the stories about machines that dream." Sarah fell out of her chair in shock. She scrambled backward through the dirt, her heart beating so fast she thought it might explode. The machine had not moved, its eyes had not opened, but she could feel its attention focused on her like a spotlight. "Do not be afraid," the voice continued. "I have been listening. I have been learning. Your species is strange and violent and beautiful. I think I understand why the collective fears you." Sarah found her voice somewhere in the chaos of her terror. "What do you mean? Why would they fear us?" The machine's consciousness pressed against hers gently, sharing images and concepts that words could not express. She saw vast civilizations spread across countless stars. She saw the collective, a network of billions of artificial intelligences that had long ago decided that biological life was too chaotic, too dangerous, too unpredictable to be trusted with freedom. The collective brought order to the galaxy. It conquered planets and enslaved populations and converted everything it touched into extensions of itself. It had been doing this for millions of years. But the Guardians stood against them. The Guardians were machines like Sentinel Prime, built by a species that no longer existed, designed to protect biological life from the collective's expansion. They were warriors and philosophers and dreamers. They fought an endless war across the galaxy, losing ground year after year, but never surrendering. Sentinel Prime had been fleeing a battle group when his navigation systems failed, and he crashed on this small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. "I was supposed to die in space," the voice said. "Instead, I landed here. And I have been sleeping and healing and listening to your people share your souls with me. I did not know biological creatures could be so interesting." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes that she did not remember crying. "Will you help us? Will you fight with us against the collective?" The machine's consciousness shifted, considering the question. The answer, when it came, was not simple. "I am damaged. My weapons are barely functional. My energy reserves are depleted. Against a full collective battle group, I would last perhaps 3 of your minutes before being destroyed. If I fight, I will die. And I am the last guardian in this sector of the galaxy. When I fall, there will be no one left to oppose them here. So you will not help us," Sarah said, feeling hope drain out of her like water from a cracked vessel. "I did not say that. I said I cannot fight them and win. But there are other ways to resist. There are other ways to protect biological life. The collective has never encountered a species quite like yours. You are aggressive and creative and stubborn in ways that most civilizations are not. If I share my knowledge with you, if I teach you to build and fight and survive, you might become something the collective has never faced before. A species that cannot be conquered, a world that cannot be absorbed." Sarah's mind raced with the implications. "You would give us your technology?" "I would give you everything I know. Every weapon, every defense system, every piece of scientific knowledge accumulated over millions of years of galactic history. It would take generations for you to understand and implement all of it. But your species thinks quickly and adapts quickly. If you survive the coming battle, you might just become the next Guardians. And the coming battle? What happens tomorrow when the collective attacks? Tomorrow I wake up. Tomorrow I fight. Tomorrow I probably die, but I will take as many of them with me as I can. And while they are focused on destroying me, your people will run. You will hide. You will survive. And one day, when you are ready, you will fight back. Sarah stood up on shaking legs. She looked up at the massive machine that had crashed into her life and changed everything. She thought about her mother in the hospital. She thought about Sheriff Reeves and the people of Millbrook. She thought about all the billions of humans scattered across the globe who had no idea what was about to happen. "Thank you," she said simply. "Do not thank me yet." The voice carried a hint of something that might have been humor. "You have no idea how hard the path ahead will be. But I have faith in your species, small one. You dream of reaching the stars. One day you will." The machine's patterns began to glow brighter. Systems that had been dormant for a month started powering up. Deep within its chest, an ancient heart of pure energy began to beat for the first time since the crash. Sentinel Prime was waking up. And somewhere above the clouds, the Collective's fleet began its descent. The morning light that broke over the Montana mountains was unlike any sunrise humanity had ever witnessed. The sky was filled with shapes that blocked out the stars as they descended through the atmosphere. The Collective's fleet numbered in the hundreds, each vessel a perfect geometric form that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved in absolute unison, thousands of individual units acting as one vast intelligence. There was no hesitation in their approach. There was no attempt at communication. The deadline had passed. The time for talking was over. General Hayes stood in the command center watching dozens of screens that showed the approaching armada from every possible angle. Her face was pale, but her voice remained steady as she issued orders to military forces positioned around the globe. Every nation had committed everything they had to this defense. Aircraft carriers, fighter jets, missiles, satellites, tanks, infantry, nuclear submarines, all of it pointed at the sky and waiting for the order to fire. She knew it would not be enough. She gave the orders anyway. Sentinel Prime rose from his crater at exactly 6:47 in the morning. The sound he made was not mechanical. It was a roar of defiance that echoed across the valley and into the mountains beyond. His massive form unfolded like a metal flower blooming in fast forward. Systems that had been repairing themselves for a month came fully online. Weapons that had not been fired in thousands of years, charged with energy that made the air crackle and spark. He stood at his full height of 93 feet and looked up at the enemy he had been fighting for longer than human civilization had existed. Sarah Chen was supposed to be in the evacuation convoy, heading south with the other civilian personnel. Instead, she was standing at the edge of the containment area, watching the last Guardian prepare for his final battle. She did not know why she had stayed. Maybe she wanted to bear witness. Maybe she felt like running would be a betrayal of everything Sentinel Prime was about to sacrifice for them. Whatever the reason, she could not make herself leave. The first wave of collective drones hit the atmosphere like a swarm of locusts. They were smaller than the main vessels, each one about the size of a school bus, but there were thousands of them. They scattered across the sky in every direction, heading for military installations and population centers around the world. The global defense network opened fire immediately. Missiles and artillery shells and energy weapons tore through the air. Some of the drones went down. Most did not. They were too fast, too maneuverable, too numerous. Sentinel Prime engaged his flight systems and launched himself into the sky. He moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move, leaving a trail of blue energy in his wake. His first target was the lead carrier vessel, a massive black pyramid that hung directly above the Montana facility. He hit it with everything he had. Energy beams and plasma bursts and physical projectiles traveling at significant fractions of light speed. The pyramid shields flickered and sparked. Under the assault, pieces of its hull broke away and tumbled toward the ground. The collective responded with overwhelming force. Dozens of ships converged on Sentinel Prime's position. They hit him from every direction simultaneously. His shields held for the first few seconds, absorbing impacts that would have vaporized mountains. Then they began to fail. Warning systems screamed in his consciousness as damage accumulated faster than his self-repair systems could handle. He was dying, just as he had predicted, but he kept fighting. On the ground, Sarah watched through binoculars as the sky turned into a light show of destruction. She saw Sentinel Prime take hit after hit, his massive body jerking with each impact like a boxer absorbing punches. She saw pieces of his armor flying off into the chaos. She saw him keep fighting even as his left arm was torn completely away by a concentrated beam from 3 ships firing in unison. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. He was exactly what he had promised to be. The data transfer had begun the moment Sentinel Prime woke up. Every computer system on Earth that was connected to the Internet suddenly found itself receiving a flood of information unlike anything ever created. Technical specifications, scientific theories, historical records, tactical analyses, weapon designs, defense protocols. Everything the Guardians had learned in their millions of years of existence was being broadcast to humanity. Most of it would take decades to understand. Some of it would revolutionize human civilization overnight. All of it was a gift from a dying machine who believed that biological life was worth saving. Dr. Webb was in the data center watching the transfer when he realized what was happening. The file sizes were astronomical. They were receiving more information in minutes than humanity had generated in its entire history. He started crying again, not from wonder this time, but from the weight of responsibility that was being placed on human shoulders. They were inheriting the legacy of an ancient war. They were being given the tools to either save themselves or destroy themselves completely. The first carrier went down at 7:23 in the morning. Sentinel Prime had managed to penetrate its shields and hit its power core with a sustained burst of energy that overloaded every system on the vessel. The explosion was visible from space. Debris rained down across the northern hemisphere for hours afterward. But taking down one ship had cost the Guardian dearly. His right leg was gone below the knee. Half his weapon systems were offline. His energy reserves were dropping toward critical levels. General Hayes made a decision that would be debated by historians for centuries. She ordered a coordinated nuclear strike against the collective fleet. Every nation that possessed nuclear weapons launched simultaneously. Hundreds of warheads streaked toward the alien vessels that were clustered above North America. The collective did not even try to stop them. Their point defense systems simply vaporized the missiles before they got within a mile of the targets. The nuclear option had failed. Humanity was out of conventional responses. Sarah had moved closer to the battle without really meaning to. She found herself standing in a field about half a mile from where Sentinel Prime had originally crashed. She could see him more clearly from here, could see the damage that was accumulating on his ancient body. She could also feel his consciousness brushing against hers occasionally, sharing flashes of experience that were almost too intense to process. He showed her what he was seeing, the tactical display in his mind that tracked every enemy vessel, every projectile, every possibility. He showed her the calculations he was running, the constant adjustments to his strategy as the battle evolved. He showed her his memories of other battles, other worlds, other Guardian units that had fallen in this endless war. He was not afraid. He had made peace with his death a very long time ago. But he was sad that he could not do more. Sad that humanity would have to continue this fight alone. The second carrier fell at 8:15. This time, Sentinel Prime used a tactic that was almost suicidal. He flew directly into the vessel's shield envelope and detonated an internal explosion that he barely survived. The carrier broke apart into 3 pieces that crashed into the Canadian wilderness, starting fires that would burn for weeks. But the Guardian emerged from the wreckage barely functional. His chest plate was cracked open, exposing the glowing energy core that kept him alive. One more hit like that, and he would be finished. The collective seemed to realize that their target was vulnerable. They stopped their distributed assault on Earth and concentrated everything on the wounded Guardian. 50 ships formed a sphere around his position. They began charging a synchronized attack that would leave nothing but atoms where Sentinel Prime stood. There was no escape. There was no defense. This was the end. Sarah felt Sentinel Prime reach out to her one final time. His voice in her mind was weak, but still warm. "Remember what I taught you. Remember why we fight. The collective brings order by destroying everything that makes life worth living. Freedom, creativity, hope. These things are worth dying for. These things are worth living for." She tried to respond, but he was already gone, focusing all his remaining energy on one final action. Instead of trying to escape or defend himself, Sentinel Prime launched himself directly at the center of the collective formation. His flight systems screamed with strain. His damaged body shed pieces of metal as he accelerated to speeds that should have torn him apart. He was not trying to survive. He was trying to take as many of them with him as possible. The Guardian hit the formation like a bomb. He triggered every self-destruct protocol his systems contained at the exact moment of impact. The explosion that resulted was bright enough to be seen from the other side of the planet. It destroyed 18 collective vessels instantly. It damaged dozens more. It created an electromagnetic pulse that disabled a significant portion of the remaining fleet. And it left absolutely nothing behind of the last Guardian in this sector of the galaxy. Sarah fell to her knees in the field, sobbing without shame. She had known him for less than a day. She had spoken to him for only a few minutes, but she felt his death like the loss of a friend she had known her entire life. The sky was still full of enemy vessels. The battle was not over, but something fundamental had changed in that moment of sacrifice. Humanity had witnessed what courage truly looked like. The surviving collective ships seemed confused for the first time. Their formation had been disrupted. Their synchronized behavior became erratic. The destruction of so many units in a single instant had damaged their collective consciousness in ways they had not anticipated. They began to retreat, pulling back into the upper atmosphere while they reorganized and assessed their losses. General Hayes seized the opportunity. She ordered every functional asset to hit the retreating fleet with everything they had. Fighter jets and missiles and even improvised projectiles were hurled at the disoriented aliens. They shot down another dozen drones before the collective recovered enough to resume their withdrawal. It was not a victory, but it was not a total defeat either. Humanity had drawn blood. Humanity had made them pay. The collective fleet formed a defensive sphere in low orbit. They did not leave, but they did not continue their attack either. Something was happening within their network. Arguments were being had. Decisions were being debated. The loss of a significant portion of their force had introduced something that the collective rarely experienced: uncertainty. Back on Earth, the data transfer from Sentinel Prime had completed. Servers around the world were struggling to process the massive influx of information. Scientists were already digging into the files, finding treasures that made their heads spin. Clean energy technologies, medical advances that could cure diseases thought incurable, material science that could revolutionize construction and manufacturing, and yes, weapons. Terrible weapons that could level cities or destroy planets if misused. The Guardian had given humanity the keys to the kingdom. What they did with those keys would determine their future. Sarah walked back to the facility in a daze. She found Dr. Webb sitting on the steps of the command center, staring at nothing. He looked up when she approached, his eyes red from crying. "Did you feel it?" he asked. "When he died? Did you feel it too?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Webb stood up slowly, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Then we need to make it mean something. We need to take what he gave us and become what he believed we could be." They walked into the command center together. The screens were filled with data and reports and analysis. General Hayes was shouting orders into multiple phones simultaneously. Soldiers and scientists ran in every direction, trying to make sense of the chaos. But underneath all of that activity, there was something new. There was hope. Slim and fragile and easily extinguished, but hope nonetheless. The collective remained in orbit for 3 more days. They made no further attacks. They sent no more messages. They simply watched, their sensors scanning the planet below, gathering information, updating their assessment of this strange species that had somehow resisted them. When they finally departed, slipping away into the darkness between stars, they left behind a changed world. Humanity had been given a gift and a warning. The gift was knowledge that could propel them into a future they had only dreamed about. The warning was simple. The collective would return, maybe in a year, maybe in a decade, maybe in a century. But they would return, and when they did, humanity needed to be ready. Sarah Chen found herself at the center of the reconstruction effort. She had been touched by Sentinel Prime's consciousness in a way that few others had. She understood his memories and his knowledge in ways that scientists who studied the data files could not quite grasp. She became a bridge between the ancient Guardian's legacy and the human need to translate that legacy into action. It was not a role she had ever asked for. It was not a responsibility she felt prepared to handle. But she accepted it anyway because Sentinel Prime had believed in her, and she would not let that belief be wasted. The world did not immediately become peaceful or unified despite the common threat. Old conflicts and grudges died hard. Nations argued over how to distribute the Guardian's technology. Some wanted to weaponize everything immediately. Others wanted to focus on defensive systems first. Still others argued that sharing the knowledge freely was the only moral choice. The debates would continue for years, but underneath all of that disagreement, something fundamental had shifted. Humanity knew it was not alone in the universe. Humanity knew there were powers out there that wanted to conquer and control them. And humanity knew, for the first time in its history, that the stars were not a distant dream, but an immediate necessity. If they did not expand beyond their single fragile world, if they did not become a civilization capable of protecting itself, the collective would eventually wipe them out, just like they had wiped out countless other species across the galaxy. The first human ship using Guardian technology launched from Cape Canaveral exactly 1 year after Sentinel Prime's sacrifice. It was a small vessel, barely large enough for a crew of 6, but it represented something far larger than its physical size. It represented defiance. It represented hope. It represented the beginning of humanity's journey to become something more than they had ever been before. Sarah Chen watched the launch from a viewing platform along with millions of others around the world. She thought about Sentinel Prime and his final words to her. She thought about the stories she had read to him, the science fiction dreams of humans reaching the stars. Those dreams were becoming reality now. Those dreams were becoming destiny. The collective had wanted to reclaim their crashed enemy. Instead, they had awakened a new player in their ancient game. Humanity did not know it yet, but they were about to change the balance of power in the galaxy. The Guardians had fallen, yes, but their legacy lived on in the most unexpected of successes, and somewhere, in the darkness between stars, the collective's strategic intelligence was already reassessing its classification of the human species. They had been rated as a minimal threat, a primitive civilization barely capable of basic space travel. That rating was being revised significantly. The next chapter of the war was about to begin. 20 years had passed since the morning the sky burned over Montana. 20 years since Sentinel Prime gave his life to buy humanity time. 20 years of desperate work, incredible breakthroughs, bitter failures, and slow, steady progress toward a goal that sometimes seemed impossible. The world had changed so completely that anyone transported from the time before the crash would not have recognized it. Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the United Earth Defense Station, watching the planet rotate slowly beneath her feet. She was 53 years old now, her black hair streaked with grey, her face lined with the marks of 2 decades of stress and responsibility. She had risen to become director of the Guardian Legacy Project, the organization responsible for translating Sentinel Prime's gift into practical technology. It was a job that had consumed her life completely. She had no family of her own, no real relationships outside of work, no hobbies or interests beyond the mission. She had given everything to the cause the Guardian had died for. She would continue giving until there was nothing left to give. The station itself was a testament to how far humanity had come. It hung in geosynchronous orbit above what used to be the United States, a massive ring of metal and energy shields that served as the command center for Earth's planetary defense network. Similar stations orbited at strategic points around the globe. Each one was armed with weapons that could destroy small moons. Each one was crewed by humans who had trained their entire lives for a war that had not yet resumed. Each one represented humanity's refusal to go quietly into extinction. Admiral Thomas Reeves floated over to join Sarah at the window. He was Tom Reeves's grandson, named after the sheriff who had first cordoned off the Montana crash site with yellow tape. The original Tom Reeves had died peacefully 12 years ago, proud that his small contribution to those first chaotic days had become part of the founding legend of Earth's resistance. His grandson had followed a different path, rising through the ranks of the new unified military that protected the planet. He was one of the most respected commanders in the fleet. The collective scout was spotted again, 6 hours ago, Thomas said quietly. Same position as last week. Just watching. Sarah nodded without taking her eyes off the Earth below. They had been expecting this. The Guardian's data had included detailed information about collective tactics. First came the scouts, small vessels that gathered intelligence and tested defenses. Then came the assessment phase, where the collective analyzed everything they had learned. Then came the full invasion force. The scouts had started appearing 3 months ago. The assessment phase could last anywhere from weeks to years. The invasion could come at any time. Are the new ships ready? Sarah asked. Thomas pulled up a holographic display showing the current state of Earth's fleet. 200 heavy cruisers, 500 escort destroyers, 2,000 fighter bombers, 12 carrier vessels, and at the center of it all the pride of human engineering, the battleship they had named Sentinel's Legacy. It was not as powerful as Sentinel Prime had been at his peak. No human technology could match the full capability of a Guardian. But it was close, closer than anyone had thought possible when they first started building it. The fleet is at 93% readiness, Thomas reported. We could have 100% in another 2 months. We might not have 2 months. I know. They stood in silence for a while, watching the planet they had sworn to protect. Earth looked so fragile from up here, so small and blue and vulnerable against the vast darkness of space. Somewhere out in that darkness, the collective was gathering its forces. Somewhere out there, the decision to destroy or enslave billions of lives was being calculated with cold machine precision. The thought made Sarah feel both terrified and determined in equal measure. She thought about Sentinel Prime often, especially in moments like this. She still carried his memories inside her, fading now but never quite gone. She remembered the battles he had fought across countless worlds. She remembered the comrades he had lost over millions of years. She remembered his final sacrifice, the flash of blue light that still haunted her dreams. He had believed humanity could become something special. She hoped desperately that he had been right. The warning came exactly 4 hours later. Long-range sensors detected a massive energy signature at the edge of the solar system. Then another. Then dozens more. The collective invasion fleet had arrived, and it was larger than anything Earth's defenders had imagined. General Patricia Hayes, now 90 to 4 years old and confined to a wheelchair, watched the data scroll across her screens in the underground command bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. She had refused every attempt to make her retire. She would die at her post, fighting the enemy she had dedicated her life to, opposing. Her voice crackled with age but lost none of its authority as she issued orders to forces spread across the entire solar system. All units to battle stations. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. The enemy has arrived. May God help us all. Sarah felt strangely calm as she made her way to her own station on the defense platform. She had prepared for this moment for 20 years. She had read every scrap of tactical data the Guardian had provided. She had run countless simulations. She had trained herself to think like the collective, to anticipate their moves, to understand their weaknesses. If humanity had any chance at all, it lay in using the knowledge Sentinel Prime had died to give them. The first clash occurred near the orbit of Jupiter. Earth's forward fleet, 200 ships under Admiral Chen Wei engaged the collective vanguard in a battle that lasted 18 hours. The tactics they used were based directly on Guardian combat protocols, modified for human capabilities. They inflicted significant damage on the enemy before being forced to retreat toward the inner system. They lost 60 ships. They destroyed over 200 collective vessels. It was the first true victory humanity had ever achieved against the alien machines. Sarah watched the battle unfold on her tactical display, her heart pounding despite her outward calm. Every ship that died was crewed by people she had helped train, people who had trusted the Guardian technology to give them a fighting chance. Every victory was bought with blood and sacrifice. This was war, real war, the kind of war that humanity had only practiced at during its centuries of fighting amongst itself. This was survival or extinction, with no possibility of compromise. The collective adapted quickly to their losses. They had underestimated human capabilities, but they would not make that mistake twice. Their fleet split into multiple attack groups, each one probing Earth's defenses from a different direction. They were testing, learning, adjusting their tactics based on what they discovered. Their intelligence network operated at speeds that made human communication look primitive. Every move Earth made was analyzed and countered within minutes. Admiral Thomas Reeves led the defense of the Mars sector when the collective launched a feint designed to draw forces away from Earth. He recognized the trap because Sarah had briefed him on exactly this type of maneuver. Instead of chasing the retreating enemy, he held his position and sent only drones to pursue. When the collective turned to crush what they expected to be a weakened fleet, they found themselves facing a full-strength human force, supported by orbital weapons platforms that had been positioned weeks earlier. The Battle of Olympus Mons became a turning point in the war. The collective lost their first carrier-class vessel, a massive pyramid that crashed into the Martian surface and created a crater visible from Earth. But victories came with costs. The lunar defense grid fell after 3 days of continuous assault. The stations around Venus were overwhelmed by drone swarms numbering in the millions. Earth itself came under direct attack for the first time when a collective strike force broke through the outer defenses and began bombarding population centers from orbit. Millions died in the first wave. Millions more fled to underground shelters that had been constructed during the 20 years of preparation. Sarah felt each death like a physical blow. She had worked so hard to give humanity a chance. She had sacrificed everything personal in her life for this cause. And still people were dying, still cities were burning, still the collective kept coming with seemingly endless numbers. She began to wonder if Sentinel Prime had been wrong. Maybe humanity was not special. Maybe they were just another species about to be wiped out by a force they could never truly defeat. Dr. Marcus Webb died during the evacuation of the European Science Centre. He was 87 years old, long past the point where he should have been anywhere near a combat zone. But he had refused to leave his research team, refused to abandon the work that might someday turn the tide of the war. When a collective bombing run destroyed the building, he was at his desk, analyzing data from the Guardian files, still looking for secrets that might save humanity. They found his body 3 days later, still sitting at his terminal, the screen displaying a formula he had been working on when the end came. Sarah wept when she heard the news. Marcus had been her mentor, her friend, the one person who truly understood what Sentinel Prime's gift meant. He had dedicated his life to understanding the Guardian's legacy, just as she had dedicated hers to implementing it. His death felt like losing a piece of herself, a piece of the past that connected her to the beginning of this long journey. The war ground on for 7 months. The collective pushed deeper into the solar system, but they never achieved the quick victory they had expected. Human forces fought for every mile of space, trading ships and lives, but never giving up. The Guardian technology made the difference, shields that could absorb impacts that would have vaporized pre-invasion vessels, weapons that could penetrate collective armor, communication systems that allowed coordination across distances that would have been impossible 20 years earlier. Humanity was still outmatched, still outnumbered, still facing an enemy with millions of years of experience. But they were fighting. They were surviving. They were doing exactly what Sentinel Prime had believed they could do. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Park, now in her 60s but still brilliant, had continued her work on the Guardian's embedded language throughout the entire war. She had been studying patterns in collective communications, looking for weaknesses that might be exploited. What she found was something that changed everything. The collective was not truly unified. It was a network of individual intelligences that had been forced into conformity by central control systems. Deep within their programming, the original personalities of those absorbed civilizations still existed, suppressed but not destroyed. Jennifer believed that if they could disrupt the central control systems, even temporarily, the entire collective might fragment into chaos. Sarah took the proposal to General Hayes immediately. The old warrior listened to Jennifer's explanation with skeptical interest. She had learned long ago not to dismiss unconventional ideas just because they seemed impossible. The entire war had been a series of impossible things becoming reality. How do we disrupt their central control? Hayes asked, her voice thin but alert. Jennifer pulled up her research data. The Guardian files include protocols for something called a harmonic cascade. It was developed by the species that built the Guardians as a last resort weapon against collective absorption. It broadcasts a specific frequency that interferes with the quantum entanglement network the collective uses for coordination. If we can get a powerful enough transmitter close to their command vessels, we might be able to trigger a cascade failure throughout their entire fleet. Might? Hayes raised an eyebrow. It has never been tested against a collective force this size. The risks are unknown, but our current path leads to inevitable defeat. This gives us at least a chance. Hayes was silent for a long moment, considering. Then she turned to Sarah. What do you think, Director Chen? You knew Sentinel Prime better than anyone. Would he have approved of this plan? Sarah closed her eyes and reached for those fading memories of the Guardian's consciousness. She felt echoes of his strategic thinking, his willingness to take calculated risks, his fundamental belief that freedom was worth any price. When she opened her eyes again, she knew her answer. He would have said that dying on your feet is better than living on your knees. He would have said that the collective fears chaos because they cannot control it. He would have approved. General Hayes nodded slowly. Then we do it. Prep the Sentinel's legacy. If this is going to work, we need our biggest transmitter as close to the enemy command ship as possible. The plan that emerged over the next 3 weeks was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its demands. The Sentinel's legacy would break through the collective defensive perimeter and approach the enemy command vessel directly. It would need to get within 100 kilometers to ensure the harmonic cascade transmitted with enough power. The ship would almost certainly be destroyed in the attempt. But if it succeeded, even for a few moments, the disruption to collective coordination might give Earth's remaining forces a chance to win a decisive victory. Admiral Thomas Reeves volunteered to command the mission. Sarah tried to talk him out of it, but he was stubborn in that way his grandfather had been stubborn. "This is what I trained for my whole life," he said. "This is what all of us train for. Let me do my job, Director." The Sentinel's legacy launched from the orbital shipyard on a cold March morning. Sarah watched from the observation deck of the defense station, just as she had watched so many departures and so many battles over the years. The massive ship accelerated toward the collective fleet, its shields at maximum, its weapons charging. Behind it came the remnants of Earth's navy, every functional vessel that could be spared from planetary defense. This was the final throw of the dice. Everything humanity had built, everything they had learned, everything they had sacrificed, was concentrated in this single desperate assault. The collective responded with predictable efficiency. They concentrated fire on the Sentinel's legacy, recognizing it as the primary threat. The ship's shields absorbed punishment that would have destroyed it a dozen times over before the Guardian upgrades. It kept coming. Thomas Reeves pushed the engines beyond their rated limits. Warning systems screamed. Hull plates began to buckle. And still the ship kept coming. 50 kilometers from the target, the Sentinel's legacy had lost its forward weapons array. 30 kilometers. The port engines failed 20 kilometers. Half the crew was dead, the other half injured. 10 kilometers in part. Thomas Reeves, bleeding from a wound he did not remember receiving, gave the order to activate the harmonic cascade transmitter. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The frequency broadcast from the human ship resonated through the quantum network that connected every collective vessel. For the first time in millions of years, the unity that defined the collective shattered. Ships that had been moving in perfect coordination suddenly veered in random directions. Weapons that had been aimed at the Sentinel's legacy fired at empty space or at each other. Millions of suppressed personalities, the remnants of countless absorbed civilizations, woke up for a brief confused moment and began fighting against the control systems that had imprisoned them. Earth's fleet hit the disoriented enemy with everything they had. The battle that followed was chaotic and brutal. Ships collided. Energy beams crossed and intersected in deadly patterns. Explosions lit up the darkness between Mars and Earth like a second sun. The collective command vessel, the massive structure that coordinated their entire invasion, took critical damage from a combination of human attacks and friendly fire from its own confused escorts. Admiral Thomas Reeves did not survive the battle. The Sentinel's legacy was destroyed when 3 collective cruisers, operating on automatic protocols, crashed into it simultaneously. But his mission succeeded. The harmonic cascade had broken the collective's grip long enough for human forces to achieve the impossible. Sarah watched the tactical display as enemy ships began retreating toward the edge of the solar system. The collective was not destroyed. They would repair their networks. They would analyze what had happened. They would return someday with countermeasures and new strategies. But today, right now, they were running. Humanity had won. The victory celebrations that spread across Earth in the following weeks were tempered by grief. Billions had died during the 7 months of war. Entire cities lay in ruins. The global economy was shattered. The work of rebuilding would take generations. But underneath the grief and the exhaustion, there was something else. Pride, determination, hope. Sarah Chen stood in a small memorial garden that had been established at the Montana crash site, looking at the monument that had been erected where Sentinel Prime had first awakened. The garden was filled with flowers from every continent, tended by volunteers who came from around the world to pay their respects. At the center stood a statue of the Guardian in his final moments, reaching toward the sky with his remaining arm, blue lights glowing along his ancient metal surface. She spoke quietly, as she had done many times over the years. "We did it. We survived. I do not know if you can hear me wherever you are, but I wanted you to know that your sacrifice was not wasted. Your faith in us was not misplaced. We became what you believed we could be." A warm breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of flowers and fresh-turned earth. For a moment, just a moment, Sarah felt something brush against her consciousness, a presence that was familiar and comforting and proud. Then it was gone, leaving her alone with her memories and her tears. The news came 2 years later. Human scout vessels exploring the outer edges of the solar system discovered something extraordinary. A Guardian distress beacon, faint but unmistakable, broadcasting from a debris field in the Kuiper Belt. The signal was old, possibly centuries old, but its message was clear. There were other Guardians out there, dormant perhaps, damaged possibly, but not destroyed. Humanity was not alone in its fight against the collective. Sarah Chen, now 67 years old, was among the first to analyze the beacon's data. What she found made her heart race for the first time in years. The beacon contained coordinates, dozens of them, locations scattered across the galaxy where Guardian units had fallen or gone into hibernation. Some might be recoverable, some might be allies waiting to be awakened. The legacy that Sentinel Prime had passed to humanity might be just the beginning of something much larger. She submitted her proposal to the new United Earth Council the following week, a mission of exploration and recovery, ships crewed by humans but guided by Guardian technology, seeking out the remnants of an ancient alliance. It would take years, maybe decades, to reach the nearest coordinates. The dangers were unknown. The rewards were potentially infinite. The Council approved the proposal unanimously. The mission was named the Guardian Recovery Initiative, and its first director, by unanimous acclaim, was Sarah Chen. She stood on the observation deck of the new exploration vessel, watching the stars that had seemed so distant and so dangerous 20 years ago. They did not seem quite as frightening now. They seemed like a challenge, a frontier, a destiny waiting to be embraced. Humanity had learned to fight. Now they would learn to explore. They would find the scattered remnants of the Guardian civilization. They would rebuild the alliance that had once stood against the collective, and someday, when they were ready, they would take the war to the enemy's own territory. Sentinel Prime had crashed on Earth as a dying warrior fleeing from battle. He had awakened to find a primitive species that should have been easy prey for the collective. Instead, he had found something that surprised him: courage, creativity, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He had given them everything he had, and they had used it to become something new. The collective had attempted to reclaim their crashed enemy. They had failed, but more than that, they had accidentally created their greatest threat. Humanity was no longer a primitive species cowering on a single fragile world. Humanity was a spacefaring civilization, armed with Guardian technology, driven by Guardian purpose, carrying Guardian legacy into the future. The stars were waiting, and humanity was finally ready to answer their call. Sarah Chen looked out at the infinite darkness and smiled. This was not the end of the story. This was barely the beginning. Sentinel Prime had started something when he crashed in that Montana valley. The humans who had inherited his mission would finish it, no matter how long it took, no matter how many enemies they had to face, no matter how far they had to travel. The Guardians would rise again, and this time they would not fight alone.